Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank CyArk for inviting me here today, for giving me a second chance. I was supposed to speak last year, and it was in the midst of the government shutdown, and so I didn't get to go. And thanks to Jamie Pursuit, who I've known for quite a few years, and I'm really excited to be here today. So I'll start by saying this is by far the lowest tech of the presentations you'll see here today, but I guess one of the virtues of being the lowest tech person on the agenda this afternoon is that I can charge my aging Galaxy 3 and iPhone 4 along the wall there, and I have no worries that any of the very high-tech people here today are going to want to steal my phones. Okay, now I get to do what all the previous speakers have done. Who's been to the Smithsonian? Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Almost every hand in the room. So I've been at the Smithsonian for a couple of years now, and was very excited to come there partly because of the mission. This is the kind of mission statement that you can fit almost anything into. You can drive a truck through this mission statement because we're all about the increase in diffusion of knowledge, going clear back to the founding in the 1840s. But what a lot of people don't realize is that the Smithsonian is a lot more than 19 museums, 9 research centers, and a zoo. We also have a lot of programs going on behind the scenes that you might not know about. I think you know that we preserve America's treasures, that we house many of the world's and America's best works of art, culture, and scientific legacy. But we also do disaster response for cultural heritage. And I think my boss, Dr. Richard Corine, would say that I got him into this in a sort of roundabout way. I was just a curator at the Minneapolis Institute of Arts. I had started a small nonprofit organization called the U.S. Committee of the Blue Shield, which is the U.S. version of an international NGO that's dedicated to preserving cultural heritage during armed conflict and supporting the 1954 Hague Convention. And I had a feeling that after I heard about the terrible Haiti earthquake of 2010, that many of our U.S. members, which include the museum community, the library community, archival community, were going to wonder, what are we going to do for our colleagues in Haiti? And thankfully, we were able to have a meeting here in Washington, D.C. in February of 2010. It was actually the day of the dreaded snowstorm. And that was where I first met Richard, and he said, I have a lot of calls from my colleagues in Haiti whom we've worked with closely since our Folklife Festival that we had back in, I think it was 2004, and they need help, and the Smithsonian stands ready to help. And so we created what came to be known as the Smithsonian Haiti Cultural Recovery Project, where we were able to go and work with colleagues right there on the ground in Haiti. Of course, after the bulk of the first humanitarian aid assistance went through, and we were able to come in as soon as the first commercial flights were available and actually go and assess the damage with our Haitian colleagues. And we had an agreement with the Ministry of Culture to work with colleagues and assist them in recovering their cherished cultural heritage. Here you see our team. It eventually emerged as an 18-month project. We received funding from the Haiti budget supplemental that Congress gave for humanitarian aid, and this was one of the first times that in a humanitarian aid package, a small percentage of that total package was allocated to cultural heritage. And we partnered with USAID on administering that. And a number of other organizations, American Institute for Conservation was a major partner, the Blue Shield, et cetera. But this was the first time that we had really put forth this type of emergency response for cultural heritage after a major disaster. And I think it was a surprise for many people who worked on this project that there's really not a very good way of doing this. I mean, UNESCO has assessment teams, and they're able to help after a time, but that idea of getting in there in those very first days or weeks, you can save a lot of cultural heritage that would otherwise be lost forever. We had a center that we rented or that we leased that had been occupied by the UN development program, and we were able to convert that into a sort of makeshift conservation lab. We had volunteers who went to Haiti, mostly conservators, on a rotating basis, and worked with Haitian colleagues. We trained more than 150 Haitian colleagues, and we were able to save and stabilize more than 30,000 works of art, books, rare books, archival collections. No, I'm not forwarding anymore. Of course, I'm the tech person who's gonna, okay, here we go. And then we had, one of our biggest programs was preserving the murals of the Holy Trinity Episcopal Cathedral there in Port-au-Prince. Very important project. Of the 14 original murals, which were painted in the 1950s, scenes of the New Testament and the life of Christ, only 3 were salvageable, and we were able to deinstall those pieces from the walls and preserve them for future use. And so this was kind of how the Smithsonian got its introduction into disaster response internationally. If you're interested, you can see our book on the project. And that was kind of how I ended up coming to the Smithsonian. I served as the international coordinator for the project while I continued to work at my curatorial job at the Minneapolis Institute of Arts. And eventually, though, the Smithsonian decided to create a position of Cultural Heritage Preservation Officer. And so I arrived here in Washington, D.C. on the very weekend that Hurricane Sandy hit the East Coast. And so I worried that I wouldn't even be able to move into my apartment. And my very first day was a conference call with the Heritage Emergency National Task Force about how to help New York after Hurricane Sandy. And so ended up going to New York pretty shortly after that with some of my conservation colleagues, helping some of the collections there. We supplied some of the funding for the American Institute of Conservation's efforts there. Colleagues from museums all around New York City cooperated and created a cultural recovery center for works of art in New York that was very much modeled on the Haiti cultural recovery model. You see here some artists were able to bring their own works of art, get advice from conservators on making repairs, etc. So, okay, this is a little bit of a jerky transition, but I just wanted to, for everybody to see the symbol of the 1954 Hague Convention. I'm wearing it on my lapel as well. And another aspect of what the Smithsonian has been doing the last few years is cooperating with the U.S. Committee of the Blue Shield and the Department of Defense in order to provide training for U.S. military on the protection of cultural heritage during armed conflict. We have a responsibility to train our soldiers. The United States became a states party to the 1954 Hague Convention in 2009. It only took us 60 years, but we are, and we just celebrated the 5th anniversary of the U.S. Engagement in that important international treaty. So that kind of leads us to this idea of international destruction of cultural heritage. Of course, there are many natural disasters that occur that threaten heritage, but lately it feels like a lot of these disasters that we're looking at where cultural heritage is damaged are man-made. So another thing that happened early on in my time at the Smithsonian was the Islamic jihadist extremist groups who occupied northern Mali, did a lot of damage to the cultural heritage, especially in the area around Timbuktu. But in early 2013, the French military, thankfully, were able to invade northern Mali and drive the jihadists out and really disengage them from their operations there. And so shortly after that, the UNESCO was able to get into Mali and actually try to do an assessment of the damage to cultural heritage, and the Smithsonian was invited to confer in that meeting for the museums to think about what we could do to help museum colleagues in Mali. A lot of you may have heard about the burning of the manuscripts collections there as the jihadists were pulling out of Timbuktu, and thankfully most of the most important manuscripts collections in Timbuktu had been secreted out of Timbuktu down to Bamako in southern Mali actually while the jihadists were still occupying, and somehow in all this taking away these cases and cases of manuscripts, they didn't notice. And so what was left at the library where they did burn manuscripts was, while it was a tragic loss of more than 2,000 manuscripts, it certainly didn't represent the bulk or the important parts of the collection. Here you see some of the important saints' mausoleums that are such icons in Timbuktu especially, and the jihadists deliberately tore down pretty much to the ground. This was actually one of the ones that was the most intact. These saints mausoleums, and only one was really left intact of the 14 that there were, or 16 that there were. And here you see the documentation from that time in Timbuktu when UNESCO actually sent a flight up to Timbuktu to document all this damage and to begin to make plans of how the Malian cultural heritage community could recover from this occupation that they suffered. So the Smithsonian, in partnership with the International Council of Museums and UNESCO, planned a museum training workshop, which took place in January of this year. And we also were able, with funding from UNESCO, to bring cultural heritage professionals from 8 other West African countries to Bamako, to the National Museum. And we did a week-long training workshop where they were able to share information amongst themselves on how they survived. They have survived conflicts that they've been through, disasters that they've been through, to teach us who were there. I had colleagues from the National Museum of Natural History, from the Smithsonian Folklife Center, who have long experience working in Africa, and we wanted to learn more from them about how they were able to preserve their own cultural heritage. And so we had a series of workshops about engaging community and museums. It might seem like a no-brainer, and it kind of is. If your community feels like they have ownership in your museum, they're a lot less likely to loot you when times are bad. And so there was what I understood is there was a real sense of community during this time and wanting to preserve collections, and I think that that's why they were fairly successful in getting out the immovable property like the manuscripts collection, because they hung together and really determined that they were going to save their heritage. And here's the kind of last day of that training workshop. And so the idea was that they would go home and work on engaging their communities and creating a space. Museums has a space to talk about difficult issues like post-conflict reconciliation, like how to preserve their cultural heritage in the face of these disasters. And what West Africa is facing now with the possibility of Ebola virus, et cetera, I really hope that this gives them something to cling to at the moment for those who need it. Then turning to Syria. We've been watching the Syrian Civil War unfold almost for 4 years now, and the looting of archaeological sites during the instability caused by the civil war in Syria was kind of the first thing we worried about, the first thing on our minds, those of us who worry about these things day and night. And the sort of, this kind of looting that we see at the major site at Apamea, you see that was before the war up top. This is what it looks like today. This is a satellite image. And actually it probably looks a bit worse today because this is a bit of an old image. We also worried about destruction of cultural heritage sites because they were being used for a military purpose, like this famous Crusader castle, Crac de Chevalier, which is also a designated World Heritage Site. And we worried about accidental damage during the fighting, what we call collateral damage to cultural heritage and cultural sites. You see here actual damage because Crac de Chevalier was used as an active fortress in fighting between the opposition and the government. But then more recently, we've been hearing in the news about intentional destruction of cultural heritage sites. You see, basically these Islamist extremist groups seeing a type of Islam that they don't agree with, that they consider veneration of saints, etc., are determined to destroy the icons of a faith that they don't agree with, or that they don't agree with the symbols that are traditional in that particular community. And I'll assert that it's also just plain a form of terrorism of the community. See here the destruction more recently of the tomb of the prophet Jonah and the mosque that contained it. So what are we doing about this? Well, I hear a lot that, well, what can you do? It's a war. It's really hard to go to these places right now. But actually, what I think a lot of people leave out of the mix is that we have colleagues who are still there. We have colleagues who are out of these countries who want to help. And there's a real need to engage everyone involved in this and to support and help our colleagues who are actually still working in Iraq and Syria to preserve their heritage. And so, University of Pennsylvania, probably a couple of years ago, started to develop the concept of the Safeguarding Heritage of Syria and Iraq project. And then I was lucky enough to meet Dr. Brian Daniels from University of Pennsylvania about a year and a half ago, and we organized a meeting at the Smithsonian, a convening of all the parties that we could find that were interested in preserving Syrian cultural heritage, both private, public, US government, even, just private citizens, Syrians who were outside the country. And we created a kind of a network of individuals and groups that were interested in this. And we've developed the project so that we have kind of two different aspects of it. We're working with Syrians who have created the Syrian Heritage Task Force, and we have an emergency component of it where we're active on the ground, but we also have a research component to this. And you can see our partners down at the bottom of the screen. And I guess the technology part of this comes with the research where we use satellite technology to assess damage to sites, but I'll get to that in a minute. So just a little bit about the Syrian Heritage Task Force. As I said, it's made up of Syrians who are working, with or thinking about ways to engage Syrians in the country and continuing the networks. Many of our Syrian colleagues who are in the US, who are in France, maintain their relationships with their colleagues, especially the ones working in opposition-controlled areas in Syria. We interface with the international community, UNESCO, ICOM, our ICOM, the museums community, Blue Shield, and they help coordinate the activities of civil society groups who are working to preserve heritage inside Syria. And they're also able to help us implement the kind of workshop that we were able to do earlier this year, this summer. We brought a group of our Syrian colleagues who are working in opposition-controlled areas, particularly in this case in northern Syria, across the border to a Turkish city that was very near the Syrian border, and we held a workshop for them. We wanted to give them information about how to secure collections in some of these damaged sites. There's so many collections where the buildings have been heavily damaged. People are keeping some of these collections in their houses in damaged areas, and so we wanted to talk to them about basic packing and crating. We wanted to create a dialogue amongst themselves because many of them are isolated from one another in the cities that they're working in, kind of on the model that I talked about a little while ago in Mali, where we brought people who don't normally interact to share their stories, talk about what they're seeing, what groups are doing the looting, which groups have now started intentionally destroying sites, etc. I brought my colleague Robert Patterson from the National Museum of the American Indian. He's a packer, crater, shipper extraordinaire, and he talked to our participants about the best ways to pack materials if you have all the resources in the world, all the way to you have no resources, you have a cardboard box and some sand. Here's how you can pack an object and save it. And Salam al-Kuntar, a Syrian archaeologist who used to work for the Syrian Ministry of Culture, is now teaching at Penn as a refugee scholar, and she came and provided us all kinds of support. She's part of the task force. and definitely helped us with the translation. Here's Dr. Brian Daniels, who's here with us today, talking about safeguarding collections that you cannot move, how to stabilize walls, and how to work with objects that are permanently installed. Our colleague who's now working in Paris, Ali Othman, talked to the participants about how to document cultural heritage. That's a really important part of this, and this is why we think a relationship with CyArk could be so beneficial here. And we are in discussions with CyArk about how we can move forward in providing training for Syrian colleagues working in these opposition-controlled areas to document their cultural heritage. And so, as you see, there's a real opportunity here for dialogue amongst the participants, learning from one another what's going on in their various cities. And then, as part of the project, which I should also mention was funded in part by the Smithsonian, but also in part by a generous gift from the Kaplan Fund. And for anybody who might be wondering, yes, this is an ongoing project, and we're always seeking generous donors. We were able to purchase a lot of materials that they are not able to get inside Syria, things like Tyvek and bubble wrap. We bought power tools, sandbags for them to fill to use on the immovable heritage sites, all these different things that they were then able to take back across the border with them. And you see here, I'm so pleased about this, they have their Tyvek, and they're packing up all of these materials that one of the participants has been keeping in his house, excuse me, with children present, and he's so glad to have the materials that he needs to be able to pack these up safely and store them. So the research portion of our project has to do with, which is in partnership with the Smithsonian, University of Pennsylvania, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And that's really where the scientific research comes in, is using geographic information systems and satellite imagery of both Syria and more recently Iraq to gauge the damage that's being done to these cultural sites, because it is difficult to go there, but the resolution that you can get off this kind of satellite imagery today is phenomenal, and we're really able to kind of gauge over time when the damage happened, how bad it is, who's in the area at the time that this damage is happening, and who is probably at fault. Excuse me. But the crux of this is that, unlike human conflict, which has been really studied from a sociological and a political science point of view for decades and decades, the similar type of analysis has not been done for cultural heritage and what happens to cultural heritage during armed conflict. And so the idea of this National Science Foundation grant that we recently received as a group is to create a research community surrounding these questions and to really bring together colleagues both from the humanitarian side who've been studying conflict for decades, along with the cultural heritage side, and look at Syria and Iraq as a test case, figure out what the right questions are to ask, see if we can create some predictive models or ways that we might, in the future, prevent or mitigate this kind of damage. So you see here, we recently launched a couple of weeks ago our first results of this. We looked at the 6 major World Heritage sites in Syria and found that there are damage to all of them except for the city of Damascus. Here's the website if anybody's interested. Take a picture of that website. It's a little too hard to pronounce, but it's basically through the AAAS website, and you can see the full resolution images of our results. So that's all I have for you today. I really welcome any questions, and thanks so much for inviting me today. Any questions? Yes?
I'm actually from Syria,
How was it possible, or how is it possible? You're sitting right in front of Brian Daniels. He'll tell you. Yeah. Anybody else? Oh, sure. Oops, no, I can't. There you go. Anybody else? It's hard to see. Yes.
Can you describe some of the differences in the challenges now from the challenges during World War II?
Oh, wow. The question was, what are some of the differences between the challenges in World War II and the challenges now? And I'd even venture to say that the difference in challenges, even when I was in Iraq in 2003, it's even changed in that 10-year period. The challenges are, I mean, the Nazis intentionally looted cultural heritage, and they did destroy some of what they called degenerate art. A lot of it they sold because they knew they could sell it on the world market and bring much needed cash back into Germany. But this idea that it has such a religious component to the destruction today, and sort of more of a almost terroristic component to really cow the community and assert your values over someone else's. I mean, there are elements to that in the Nazi regime as well, but and just the kind of tactics that are being used today, I think, are pretty horrifying as well. So both conflicts really terrible for people as well as for cultural heritage, though. Yes, sir.
Talk to here about putting their scanners on military vehicles?
That's a good idea. I don't think we have too many U.S. military vehicles on the ground in Syria, except for the ones that ISIL has stolen from the United States. And we're pretty busy blowing those up right now whenever we get a chance. So maybe that's not such a good idea. You think your drivers are hard on things, the commercial drivers, wait till you give a soldier something like that. Yes? No, but we'd welcome any discussion. I mean, we're in conversation with a lot of different possible donors, so. Yes, sir.
I'm first of all struck by the correlation between Ben Caceres observing the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas and then what you're experiencing in your organization. Have you given any thought to kind of proactive approach? And I know it's like trying to predict where the next disaster is going to occur, but getting some documentation in around the world, like at CyArk, in advance of something happening, which is what the Sub 500 is partially.
Right, yeah.
But taking that out for any scale in your organization.
Yeah, I did. In my 20 minutes, I didn't really have a lot of time to go into that, but now that you ask, that's actually how I met Jamie Pursuit. It was at the Archaeological Institute of America conference, where we were having basically an after-action review of the Blue Shield's no-strike list for Libya, which the Department of Defense used to try to be sure they hit no important cultural heritage sites during that UN operation, NATO operation. Yeah, we are actively looking at countries who are experiencing armed conflict or at least political instability that we think are at risk. And it's not just, our project necessarily, but the Smithsonian has a lot of other partners like the International Council of Museums, whom I work with closely. We're trying to document where all the point coordinates, latitude, longitude for all the museums in various countries. And we're trying to do like a cultural map of the world to find those most important sites. And it's easy to know where the World Heritage sites are because that's documented by UNESCO. It's when you start to get into the mid-level, and the United States, we're not the greatest at it either. If you ask any museum director in the United States what the latitude and longitude of their museum is, they're not going to know. And so these are the kind of things, though, that the scientists who are doing this geographic information systems, that's the fodder of their science. And that's, quite frankly, if you tell the military your address and not to bomb it, they're going to say, what's the 8-digit grid coordinate? Because if you don't know that, it's hard for them to avoid it. So we are looking at that, and it's a big, big job though. And there are a lot of groups that we're trying to collaborate and coordinate on how best to move forward on that. Anybody else? I don't want to keep you from happy hour or anything. So, okay, thanks very much. Oh, one more?
Sorry, just to speak to that last point, early on in Iraq, what they found was that whenever the U.S. troops would not target a specific site, then the opposition would use that site to cover. So have you sort of discussed how to get around that?
Yeah, I don't know if there is a good answer to that. It's kind of like when the military thinks about targeting and bad guys are using a cultural heritage site for cover, they run through MDMP, the military decision-making process, and they say, what is going to be the benefit of this? Because that site does lose its protection under international law when it's used for a military purpose. But they have to ask themselves, is this really a threat to us? Is this really going to cause a degradation in our military operations? And, this is what the Hague Convention asked them to do. Be educated, be knowledgeable about where these sites are, and make a smart decision about, if your people are in danger of being killed by a sniper from one of these sites, by all means, you may have to take it out. But don't make that decision in an uneducated way. And if you can avoid it and preserve that site for future generations, those people are going to thank you more than they are the guys who are putting it at risk. So, thanks very much.